It was a crisp early morning, with the sun barely cresting the horizon, painting the road in soft shades of orange and yellow. William Harris, a 52-year-old retired U.S. Army general, was driving his sturdy SUV down the highway. The back seat of his car was strapped with a thick seatbelt, secured as tightly as steel. In William's life, the safe in the back seat wasn't just an ordinary object. To anyone else, it was a cold metal box. But to William, it held everything he valued: personal documents, military awards, and family heirlooms. It wasn't just locked, it was reinforced. If anyone dared tamper with it, the security system would spray an indelible paint, marking the intruder for all to see. But William didn't think it would ever come to that. He was simply enjoying the quiet of the open road, clearing his mind, letting the chaos of the world slip away. However, that peace didn't last long. In the rearview mirror, he saw the bright flash of red and blue lights, and the wail of a siren shattered the calm inside him. "Damn it," William muttered, exhaling sharply under his breath. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, glancing at the speedometer. Nothing was out of the ordinary. He wasn't speeding. There were no broken lights, no violations. But the patrol car had appeared and was waving him over. With a sigh, he pulled the car over to the shoulder. The sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires echoed as he slowed to a stop. The patrol car stopped beside him, and a man stepped out. Sergeant Daniel Mason, in his late 40s, wore a scowl as if anger had been etched into his face for years. William immediately knew this wasn't going to be a casual roadside chat. "Sir," Mason called out, his voice sharp as he approached William's window. His eyes were fixed on the back seat, staring at the bulky safe. "That's quite the package you've got there," Mason said in a cold tone. "Mind telling me what's inside?" William rolled the window down just enough to speak, but remained calm, his tone steady and collected. "Good morning, officer. It's just personal items. Nothing illegal, I assure you." Mason raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by the answer. "Personal items in a safe on the backseat? That seems a bit unusual, don't you think?" William could feel his patience beginning to fray, but he remained composed. Knowing that unusual didn't equate to illegal, Daniel Mason sneered, leaning in toward the window. "Then why don't you open it up for me, just to make sure there's nothing dangerous in there?" William Harris stared directly into Mason's eyes, his expression unwavering. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't open anything unless I'm required to," William replied, his voice calm. "There's no legitimate reason to." Mason's smirk immediately vanished, replaced by a tight frown. He straightened up, his arms crossing as though he were preparing for a standoff. "Now listen here," Mason began, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "I've seen all kinds of strange things on this highway, but a safe this suspicious?" William exhaled slowly, his jaw clenched. "I haven't broken any laws, Sergeant," William said, his gaze never leaving Mason. "If you have a reason to detain me, then say so. If not, I'd like to continue." Mason didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered to the safe, then back to William. He stood still for a moment, as if he might let the matter go. But his face told a different story. He wasn't finished yet. As Mason stepped back toward his patrol car, William's grip tightened on the wheel. He knew this wasn't going to end with a simple warning. The tension in the air felt like a storm was brewing. Mason stood there for a moment, his hands on his hips, his eyes scanning the SUV as if he were Sherlock Holmes solving a mystery. You could almost hear the gears turning in his head without needing to look too closely. "Excuse me, you're on leave," Mason said, then swaggered around the back of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as though he owned the place. "All right, let's see what's so important that you can't let me take a peek," Mason declared, his hand reaching for the door handle. William moved out of the driver's seat in an instant. His calm demeanor was replaced with an unmistakable authority. He stood between Mason and the door, his voice low and steady, but carrying the weight of someone who had faced much greater challenges than a curious cop. "Don't touch it," William said. "It's my property. You have no right." He stood firm like a steel wall, unyielding and immovable. For a moment, It seemed like Mason might step back, but then a sneer appeared on his lips. He wasn't just annoyed. He was being challenged. "Oh, I think I do," Mason sneered, stepping back toward his patrol car. "If you're going to make this difficult, I'll handle it myself." William stayed still, his eyes never leaving Mason as he opened the trunk and pulled out a crowbar. Mason twirled it in his hand as though it were a prized trophy, then stepped confidently toward the SUV. "Look at you refusing to cooperate, and I have a job to do," Mason said, his tone dripping with self-satisfaction. "So let's just say this is happening whether you like it or not." William remained unmoved, instead stepping back slightly, his voice calm but carrying a clear warning. "You're making a mistake, Sergeant," William said, his arms crossing like an immovable force. Of course, Mason ignored him, shoving the crowbar under the lip of the safe's door, grunting as he applied pressure. "A big mistake," Mason muttered. "The only mistake here is thinking you can drive down my highway with this thing and not get checked." And then, like a faint hiss filling the air, almost inaudible, followed by a loud explosion. Before Mason could react, a bright green paint shot out of the safe like a firework, striking him directly in the face. The impact was so sudden that Daniel Mason dropped the crowbar, stumbling backward as the paint splattered across his face and uniform, spreading across his hands like an alien attack. "What the hell?" Mason roared, flailing his arms as though he could shake off the paint, but it wouldn't budge. William Harris stood aside, watching the spectacle with an almost imperceptible smile. The sight of the sergeant now resembled a walking neon sign, glowing brightly in the morning sun, almost too much to bear. "I warned you," William said, his voice dry as a desert. "The safe has a security system. You didn't listen." Mason wiped his face, but the paint only smeared, clinging stubbornly to his skin and uniform. "Yeah, this is assault," Mason stammered, pointing a shaky, paint-covered finger at William. "You attacked me." William raised an eyebrow, gesturing gently toward the safe. "No, Sergeant," William replied, his voice even. "That's just a safety feature. Maybe next time you'll think twice before tampering with someone else's property." Mason stamped his foot, still flailing as though hoping the paint would somehow vanish. "You'll regret this," Mason roared. "I'll cuff you before you can say a word." William cut him off, holding up his phone, his voice soft but decisive. "Just so you know," William said, "I've recorded the whole thing. It's about time you understand my need for safety." Mason stood frozen, fury in his eyes, his jaw covered in paint, his mouth hanging open for the first time that morning. The smugness on his face vanished, replaced by a look of panic. William could almost hear the wheels turning in Mason's head as he realized how bad this situation had just become. "Are you planning to look at anything else?" William asked coldly, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Or are we done here?" Mason stood frozen, unable to take his eyes off the SUV, his uniform now a joke. His face and hands were drenched in neon green paint, sparkling grotesquely under the sunlight. He sighed, opened the trunk, and grabbed a water bottle, splashing it onto his face. Furious. "Can't this stuff come off?" Mason shouted, his voice a mix of rage and panic. He scrubbed harder, but the paint only spread further, now dripping down onto his boots. If anything could make him look more ridiculous, it was this scene. William casually leaned against the SUV's armrest, watching the chaos unfold as if it were a Saturday morning cartoon. "On industrial security," William said, his tone calm, with a hint of amusement. "This system was designed to make an impression." Daniel Mason spun around to glare at William Harris, his eyes smeared with paint. "You think this is funny?" Mason growled. "You've assaulted a police officer. That's a felony." He pointed a paint-covered finger at William, drops of paint splattering down, staining William's hands, like an accusation that sounded more desperate than authoritative. William remained unfazed. Instead, he calmly walked around to the back of his SUV, opened the trunk, and pulled out a neatly organized stack of documents. He flipped through them until he found exactly what he was looking for, then turned back to face Mason. He held the paperwork up, "This isn't assault, Sergeant," William said firmly. "In fact, it's a fully legal and registered security feature. Would you like to read the details? Or should I call your supervisor to explain?" Mason just stood there, blinking through the layers of paint now starting to dry in strange patches on his face. The thick document might have seemed like a dropped microphone, but Mason wasn't ready to back down. "You think this paperwork is going to save you?" Mason sneered, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. "I know how to deal with people like you." William raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, the sound of an approaching car broke the tension in the air. A blue sedan slowed down, the driver clearly curious about the odd scene unfolding ahead. The car stopped a few meters away. The driver, a man in his 30s with a smartphone in hand, got out of the vehicle. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his phone clearly pointing at Mason. Mason froze for a moment. His paint-covered hands hovered awkwardly in the air. "Sir, this is official police business," Mason said, trying to regain some semblance of authority in his voice. But the confusion was unmistakable. The man stood still, looking more like he was witnessing a paintball accident than a routine traffic stop. "What is he doing?" the driver asked with a smirk. "I'll be back and make sure I get everything on tape." Just to be clear, William couldn't help but let a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth as he stepped aside, giving the camera a clear view of Mason's face, now a mix of fury and fear. Mason knew he was losing control of the situation, and the presence of a witness with a camera only made things worse. Mason mumbled something under his breath and stormed back to his patrol car, leaving streaks of blue paint wherever he stepped. "You'll regret this," Mason muttered over his shoulder before slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and an entertained audience. William exhaled, turning to the man with the camera, speaking casually. "Thanks for stopping by. I think you just made my day a lot easier." "No problem," the man replied, grinning widely. "I'll make sure the right people see this. That guy won't be living this down anytime soon." Hash, hash, hash. He laughed heartily before returning to his car. William slid into his own vehicle and drove off, calmly aware that the green paint and the video evidence would handle the rest within hours. The video of Mason, drenched in paint, quickly went viral across social media, sparking outrage from the public and giving rise to countless mocking memes. By the next day, Mason had become the laughingstock of his own department, with colleagues constantly ridiculing him. Local media picked up the story, highlighting the incident in their news broadcasts, turning Mason into a target of public scorn. That same day, Mason was summoned to a meeting with his captain. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Mason?" the captain asked, his voice seething with anger. "The man you harassed is William Harris, a retired U.S. Army general, highly respected in the military with decades of service and countless honors." Mason stood there, his face frozen in shock, unable to speak as he realized the severity of the situation. "We will be conducting an internal investigation," the captain added, his sharp gaze fixed on Mason. "You need to understand that your career might be over after one foolish act." Meanwhile, William Harris was enjoying a quiet morning. He scrolled through the memes about Mason, slightly amused by the humor of the bizarre situation he had witnessed. He called the police department, his voice calm yet resolute. "Yes, I want to make sure the proper actions are taken. Justice must be served," William said, his tone unwavering. He went about his life, content in the knowledge that the lesson had been clearly delivered. Mason would now face the consequences of his actions, while William understood that what had happened was necessary to uphold order and dignity. Thank you for supporting the channel, and stay tuned for more exciting stories here at Mr. Wisdom Story. Be sure to subscribe to receive the latest videos. Wishing you happiness and peace.